for the Positive Aging Week. And sorry, I just got that message about the recording. It's really my pleasure to join you today and to have the chance to talk about what we're doing for the global campaign to combat ageism. Hopefully encourage all of you to join the global campaign to combat ageism, and also use this opportunity to share the key findings of the first UN Global Report on Ageism, which we just launched earlier this year. And we actually just had the regional launch in Europe earlier this week, so yesterday. So I'm just going to share my slides, and I'd be grateful if maybe Christine, you could let me know if you can see them full screen, because I can't, I don't know what you see.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right. So before I go into the key findings of the Global Report on Ageism, I wanted to provide you with a bit of a background or context for the global campaign to combat ageism, because many of you may be wondering why the WHO is leading this global campaign to combat ageism and trying to work with other partners on this topic. And as you see on this slide, everything kind of started in the year 2016. This was the time when the 194 member states of the World Health Organization came together and asked the Director General to develop, in cooperation with other partners, a global campaign to combat ageism, with the goal of enhancing the day-to-day experience of older people and optimize policy responses. This marked obviously a turning point. I think it was at this point in time when member states started to realize that unless ageism was addressed, it was going to be very difficult to advance policies and programs on aging at country level, because people would part from misconceptions around aging, stereotypes related to older people, which would then lead to inadequate responses to whatever needs they had identified. So at this point in time, with the adoption of the Global Strategy and Action Plan on Aging and Health, and this direct request for a campaign, we got started in this big project. The vision for the global campaign to combat ageism is a world for all ages. And our aim is to create that world for all ages by changing the way we think, feel, and act towards age and aging. And you will see in a second why this mission makes sense for the campaign. Countries' commitment to address ageism was again reaffirmed in the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, which was just adopted last year. The UN Decade of Healthy Aging is running between 2021, so this year, and 2030. So we're just getting started on this 10-year-long journey. But the good news about the Decade of Healthy Aging is that combating ageism is one of the 4 action areas, and it's also highlighted as a prerequisite for achieving the other 3 action areas, which you see displayed on the slide. So again, there's a very big focus still today from member states and from different sectors to address ageism, so that we can build that world for all ages that I was just mentioning. But if we move now to the key findings of the Global Report on Ageism, I wanted to first start with the definition of ageism, because there are also different, sometimes different definitions are used. And one of the things that we try to do with this Global Report on Ageism is to provide a common framework for us to move forward. So when we talk about ageism, we're really referring to how we think, how we feel, and how we act, both towards others, but also towards ourselves on the basis of age. This means that ageism includes 3 different dimensions: how we think, which are the stereotypes, how we feel, which is prejudice, and how we act, which is discrimination. This is very important because, of course, any effort to address ageism should consider these 3 dimensions. It won't be enough if we just address discrimination, and it won't be enough if we just address stereotypes. It's important that we consider that it has those 3 dimensions that are mutually reinforcing. So stereotypes can lead to discrimination, discrimination can lead to prejudice. So again, it's important that we consider the 3. And here also in the definition, you see why the mission of the campaign makes sense, as we're trying to change the way we think, feel, and act towards age and aging. The report also showed that ageism is everywhere and that it can affect people of any age. though our individual experiences of ageism may differ depending on the life stage that we're at. We know now that around the age of 4, we're already aware of the age stereotypes that exist in our culture. And we start internalizing them and using them to guide how we feel and how we act towards other people, but also towards ourselves. And I was wondering whether at this point in the presentation, also to make it a bit more interactive, you could let me know where you see ageism around you, what examples of ageism you have come across, either personally or you have maybe witnessed those experiences around you. And you can either provide them in the chat or just, I don't know what you prefer, Christine. If people provide.
Yeah, people could hold up their hand, but if
or pull up their hand. Yes, yeah. Either is fine.
Use the reactions button there to hold up a hand, no problem.
It is very present in society, so I'd be surprised if you haven't encountered it anywhere. I think we have, yes, we have one comment in the chat saying people of all ages being told they're too young, too old to take part and achieve all sorts of things. Exactly. Changing employment, very great example. In the media, healthcare, too old to have a child, doctors treating older people differently. Yeah, so these are all exactly. So these are all great examples of where ageism plays out in our life. And basically, if we take a look, we'll see that ageism exists in our institutions. So some of you mentioned media, you mentioned employment, you mentioned healthcare. It also is present, for example, in the legal system, in the financial system. It's present in so many sectors of society, but it's also present in our relationships. I believe one of you said how maybe someone can tell you that you're too old to have a child, for example, or just people telling you you're too old or too young to be or do something. We also see ageism playing out when we interact with one another. And finally, we see it in ourselves, which is what we call self-directed ageism. And this is the process that I was describing earlier. We start internalizing those age-based biases from our surrounding culture after being repeatedly exposed to those biases, and then we apply them to ourselves. So for example, younger people may internalize the stereotype that in younger age, you don't have sufficient experience to have anything to contribute to, I don't know, a decision-making table at work. And you may therefore not participate in decision-making spaces. And older individuals may internalize the stereotype that I've heard so often that you lose creativity the older you get, which is a very false stereotype. And if people internalize that stereotype, they may not then, for example, pursue a long dream to, I don't know, study something else at university or take up a new hobby. So again, the key message in this slide is that ageism is really present at very different levels. So at that institutional level, also in our relationships and in ourselves. In terms of the prevalence, what we see is that 1 in 2 people are ageist against older people globally. That is half the world's population. And we see higher rates in low and lower middle income countries, as you see reflected on the slide. And if we look at ageism against younger people, and here we don't have global data, but we do have data from the European region, we see that younger people report more ageism than other age groups, including older adults in this region. And in fact, older people are the group that reports after younger people the most experienced age-based discrimination in this region. And in Europe, we do see that ageism is more pervasive than sexism and racism, based on reports from participants. Ageism is not only everywhere, and it doesn't only affect us all, it is also very harmful and costly. The report shows that ageism has far-reaching impacts on all aspects of our health and well-being. For example, it's associated with poor and physical and mental health. In terms of physical health, we're talking here about the presence of chronic conditions, the number of acute medical events and hospitalizations being increased by ageism. And if we look at mental health, we see that ageism accelerates cognitive decline. and that it is associated with the onset of depression, lifetime depression, and an increase in depressive symptoms over time. It also is associated with earlier death, and this was found in different studies that were conducted across countries, where they saw that, for example, in one of these studies, just to give you a bit of detail into this, one of these studies that was conducted in China, it found that older people with negative attitudes towards aging had an almost 20% higher chance of dying over a 6-year period than those with more positive self-perceptions. So again, a very direct association here between ageism and our longevity. In terms of our well-being, ageism has also been shown to decrease our quality of life and the likelihood of social isolation and loneliness. And ageism, though ageism obviously has these effects on its own, it also intersects and can exacerbate other forms of disadvantage, making these effects on our health and well-being even worse. But the positive message that the report does bring is that we can do something to address ageism. The report identified 3 strategies that work in addressing ageism, and these are strategies that are based on the strongest available evidence. These are policy and law, educational activities, and intergenerational interventions. The first one, policy and law, this can help us address discrimination and inequality on the basis of age and protect the human rights of every person. Importantly, this strategy can be useful in addressing ageism against both younger and older people, so against any age group, basically. But the important point here is not just that we draft a policy or law, but also that we put in place the mechanisms that are required to implement and monitor the effective implementation of that policy or that law. These can include courts, human rights agencies, or ombudspersons, or other types of bodies that may be applicable in a given country. The second evidence-based strategy that we know works in addressing ageism is educational activities. And these can enhance empathy and also dispel misconceptions and reduce prejudice by providing accurate information and counter stereotypical examples. Educational activities are very diverse. They can include things like instruction that transmits information, so kind of like a course. But they can also include activities like role-playing, simulation, and even virtual reality. In the report, we provide examples from different countries, examples of educational activities that have been implemented in different places, and that make use of these different types of formats. Educational activities are among the most effective strategies for reducing ageism against older people, but we don't know that much about their effectiveness for reducing ageism against younger people. So this is an area that requires further research. And last but not least, we have intergenerational interventions, which, as the name indicates, bring together younger and older people to work on a common task or an area of interest. These aim to foster that interaction between different generations. And just as I said that educational activities were very diverse, intergenerational interventions can be as diverse as the many interests that any one of us can have. So they can include joint cooking, for example, between older and younger people, or engaging in gardening, painting, watching a film, sharing stories, living together. So again, they're very diverse. And they're very effective interventions for reducing ageism against older people, and also show promise for reducing ageism against younger people. Where possible, the report does suggest or recommend trying to implement these 3 strategies together to try to maximize impact. The UN Global Report on Ageism concludes with 3 recommendations for action. And the first one you probably guessed, it's to invest in these 3 strategies that we know work in addressing ageism. We already know what works. Now it's a matter of investing and then making sure that we implement these strategies. The second recommendation for action, which is very important, is that we need to improve data and research to gain a better understanding of ageism and how to reduce it. I already flagged in the presentation a few areas that require further research. So for example, around the effectiveness of educational interventions in addressing ageism against younger people. We also don't yet have global prevalence data on ageism against younger populations. So again, there are a few areas that require further research. We also have little information from low and lower middle income countries still. So these are research gaps that we're trying to encourage are covered and addressed in the coming years. And the final recommendation for action, and this perhaps the one that I guess links to every single one of us, is that we need to build a movement to change the existing negative narrative around age and aging. And in that regard, we all have a role to play, as I was saying. Here it's about each one of us continuing the conversation that we're having here today with our family, with our friends. It's also about challenging ageism when we see it and asking questions about maybe some assumptions that every one of us has made. We've all grown up in an ageist society, unfortunately, but it's also within our hand to start questioning some of those misconceptions that we've been surrounded by. So this change is possible, but of course, it does require collective effort. And to help us build that movement to change the narrative, the World Health Organization has pulled together this toolkit that you see reflected on the slide. It's a living toolkit. So the idea is that we will continue to expand the resources that are made available as we learn what is working and what is not working, as we get feedback from all of you in terms of what you have found useful and what maybe you found missing. But the general idea is that it provides you with a very comprehensive set of resources to be able to take action where you are. These include things like a conversation guide that can help you initiate conversations around ageism, as I was mentioning earlier, at home with your family and friends, or maybe with your colleagues at work or your employer, or with your students if you're a teacher, or with policymakers. It also includes an event guide to help you organize your own events on ageism, including a slide deck and key steps that you may want to consider when planning that event, as well as infographics. There's a film of the campaign. There's also a wide range of social media assets that we hope you can use to reach beyond your immediate community. All, again, using the hashtag of the campaign, which is a world for all ages, which you may remember is the vision of the campaign. And as part of this third recommendation of building a movement to change the narrative, the global campaign to combat ageism is currently running a sustained theme on ageism between the 1st of October, which is this Friday, International Day of Older Persons, and the 20th of November, which is World Children's Day. The title of the theme or initiative, which you see on the slide, is Ageism Through the Ages. And what we will be doing during the month and a half is that we will be releasing content related to ageism on the platform for the Decade of Healthy Aging and on various social media platforms using this life course lens and giving initial focus to ageism as it affects older people at the beginning of October, and then moving the focus progressively towards ageism as it affects younger people and children. We're also going to have a series of events on ageism that will be announced and are made available on the platform and through other channels to engage, again, as many people as possible in this movement. The first of such events is actually happening this Sunday, 3rd of October. And you see a little image on the right-hand side of the slide. And this involves the international premiere of the documentary film Duty Free, which reflects ageism in employment, or talks about ageism in employment. The great thing is that the online event is going to be live captioned into all UN languages. We don't want barriers. We want everyone to join the event. And it will also include a great panel debate following the film screening, which will include the main character of the documentary film, Rebecca Danigelis, as well as her son and film director, Sian Pierre, and the ILO Deputy Director General Martin Newton, who will be able to provide that content, that context around how ageism plays out in different countries.
All right, good luck. Yeah, good luck sorting. Do you put happy music on when you're doing stuff
there
like
is
that?
Someone seems to have their microphone.
Excuse me, could you mute your microphone, please? Whoever's got their microphone open, thank you.
I will be providing the link to this event as well as the link to the campaign and all resources after the presentation. But before I close the presentation, I just wanted to summarize that basically ageism affects all of us. It's everywhere and it's very harmful to our health, well-being, and our economies. But that the good news is that we can combat it, and that I really hope that you join the movement to help create a world for all ages. I am very happy to be here. I hope there are many questions following the presentation. And like I said, I will be sharing the relevant links on the chat so that you can take a look through the resources or anything else that you may be interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vania. A very interesting presentation. And I think for those who are only new to coming into DCU and Age Friendly, it certainly resonates with the fundamental areas we're looking at in the universities and the global network. And some of the things you just mentioned there, I just want to mention that normally on the 1st of October, we have an event to mark a UN Day of older people called Operation Conversation. And literally it's a conversation with people where they go on a walk and they have a chat about different aspects of aging. This year, we're going to be doing it as a virtual presentation, and it's on digital equity, as you know, for the UN Day of Older People. And we'll have our Professor Mark Brown speaking about that. The other thing I want to mention is we have a conference in November on the circular economy and the future of aging. And this is one of the big areas we want to address about workers and around working, the experiences of people as they age. And just what we were speaking about before you came on was about the idea that there's always a conversation that older workers have a deficit. They need skill training, they need this, where in actual fact it's a question of educating employers. And I think that's really important. And I think in Ireland, we have a very segregated society, although I don't think people realise that, where younger people are there seems to be an us and them, and that there's, if you go down to some of the more popular areas of Dublin City at night time and the weekends, it's mostly populated with younger people. And if you're an older person, you just to get like a sore thumb. Mm-hmm. So I think Alwyn made a comment there about socially too old to take part. So I absolutely, I can see how that is relevant as well. So does anybody else want to jump in there and just make a point there with Vania and just express their opinion about the subject matter?
I just shared some of the links, but if there are others that you are also interested in, let me know.
Well, don't be shy now. We're all very quiet this morning.
Hi, it's Veronica Williams here. I just want to say thanks a million, because this is my first time to actually take part in this, and I will be celebrating my 66th year at the end of October with a lovely family get together. So it's great. But yeah, I think it's great to hear this today. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, I think it's time to really break down the barriers. Like you say, young and old, and it's true. You can't go out. Well, I live in Cavan now, but you can't go out in very many places if you're an older person. So I'm still 20 in the soul. But there, yeah. So thanks. We just want to say thanks. It was great.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I mean, I agree. There's so many barriers still to be addressed and removed. And the aim here is, again, that we're going to now that we know what works, is then that next step is providing support so that these strategies are taken up, and so that we cover the gaps that I explained, and so that we encourage everyone to, as I was mentioning, change this narrative, because it's true that we keep seeing it. I think the pandemic has only magnified how ageist our societies are. And I think it's time that everyone starts challenging it the moment that they see it. I mean, we see it in humor around us. It's so accepted, and there's still a lot of work to do, but there's also a push now to change society and to change this in society. And I think we're starting to see some very positive initiatives in different countries. So I'm very hopeful that even though this is a long-term journey, that we will get there.
And I think that the role of universities in that journey is really, really important, because we have an opportunity to speak to a much younger cohort of people and to start them, to help them take an ownership of this and say that ageism just doesn't affect older people, it does affect us, and just look at changing the narrative on aging and having a more age inclusive approach. Eileen there has a comment. I think it's important to acknowledge the example of older people to show the rest of us how to live again with their resilience and acceptance of change.
Yeah.
Absolutely, again. And I see there's a question there about the email links. We'd love to see this lecture again. Yes, it's recorded, so we'll be sending it out to everybody this afternoon who's participated.
And there's another comment also around employment, which I mean, I only vaguely touched on, but this is clearly one of the institutional settings where we see a lot of ageism, both against older people, but also against younger people, even if the experiences are different. So for example, with regards to ageism against older people, we see clear discrimination, for example, in access to opportunities to get a job in the first place. We also see that it can affect retirement decisions and whether, for example, older people are considered for training or even promotions within their current job. So again, has very clear effects on older workers. With regards to younger people, we see, for example, that it mainly affects them once they have a job in terms of their benefits and pay. So they may get a lot less pay and less benefits for the same type of job that maybe someone else is carrying out in the same company, but who's older. And they also tend to receive more belittling comments and remarks that kind of question their whether they have valid points of view and relevant experience in the workplace. So again, it affects them differently. In fact, there was an interesting survey carried out in Europe that showed that ageism in employment, if you look at how it affects different ages, it kind of takes, if you look at a graph, kind of like a U curve, which shows that it peaks at around the age of 20, and then again at around the age of 59. So again, clearly this is an example where ageism affects us differently, but both when we're younger and when we're older.
Finally, there's a few more questions there in the chat box from Isolde saying, I was disappointed to hear that lower income or so-called third world countries had higher levels of discrimination against older people. And there's also, so do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a question, but there's often a misconception actually that ageism is only an issue that affects Western or high income countries, depends on who you ask, but there's this common misconception. And I mean, what the data shows is that it's actually very present across countries, even if we see higher rates in low and lower middle income countries. There seems to be a correlation, for example, with the healthy life expectancy of the country, which you could say that if generally low and lower middle income countries tend to have a lower healthy life expectancy, which means that it is more likely that older people living in those contexts are not as, well, that they can meet some of the stereotypes that people may have about older people. And therefore that can reinforce existing stereotypes around older people. But yeah, these are definitely the figures that we do see. And we hope that this changes obviously over time and as we start implementing these interventions.
And I see there's a question there. Could you give us your top 3 root causes for ageism towards older adults?
There aren't, I guess it's a very difficult question in the sense that, I mean, it's the same as if you ask someone, what are the root causes of racism or sexism? And there are often many different causes, but 3 theories that have some empirical support that we also discuss in the report and that can explain why ageism may exist include, for example, what is called the terror management theory, which basically says that because older people remind us of the inevitability of death or death approaching, that then younger people may be prejudiced and discriminate against older people because they want to distance themselves with that idea of death being inevitable. So that's the first theory that has been used to explain why ageism against older people may exist. A second theory that has been used to explain ageism is what is called intergroup threat theory, which poses that groups external to your own who pose a threat, either symbolic or real, that you try to distance yourself from them and that you can have a negative reaction towards them. This has been, for example, very used to explain why ageism may exist against younger people. So younger people, for example, could represent a threat to middle-aged adults in terms of, I don't know, those stereotypes, right, that people may have about younger people being very tech savvy or very creative, and then middle-aged people may be feeling threatened by those existing stereotypes because they're not always true. Obviously, they box everyone in the same way. And then middle-aged people in that sense, maybe wanting to distance themselves from that other age group. So that's the second theory that has been used. And the last one is what is called stereotype embodiment theory, which helps to explain mostly how self-directed ageism works, in the sense that stigmatized groups tend to eventually internalize and embed and embody the stereotypes and the biases that they have seen and that they have been exposed to, basically, in their lifetime, and eventually apply them to themselves with the effects on their health and well-being that we saw earlier.
Okay, there's a comment there about the COVID discrimination against older people in health decisions. And there's also a comment from Lucy Vidvoka she's actually from the Czech Republic, one of our partner organizations. And she says, what's your answer to question whether getting rid of ageism means getting rid of age as a characteristic completely? Where is their line between healthy and unhealthy use of age in our societies?
Yeah, so should I first?
Whichever one you want to do first. Yeah.
So regarding COVID, I mean, as I was saying earlier, in the pandemic, we don't yet have detailed data about whether the prevalence of ageism has increased. What we do know for sure is that the pandemic has magnified, I think, the ageism that already existed in our societies. As the comment says, we have seen that age has been applied in certain contexts as the sole criterion to limit access to intensive care units and to other life-saving therapies. So again, this has been used also in terms of the confinement measures in certain countries. We have information that, for example, only older people were asked to remain at home for larger periods of time, or even when confinement measures were lifted, it was only older people who were not then allowed, for example, entry even to places that you would need to even do grocery shopping. So in some cases, they were not even allowed to access shopping malls, in other places, public transport. So again, we have seen that very discriminatory approach against older people in the context of the pandemic. We've also seen a lot of ageism in discourse in the media during the pandemic. I'm sure all of you have very clear examples of that, where we've seen, for example, older people being homogeneously stereotyped as frail and vulnerable and dependent, and then younger people being homogeneously stereotyped as invincible and selfish, which obviously does not reflect the great diversity that we see in both age groups and can be very harmful. We already know that exposure to ageist media can have direct effects and can have those harmful effects on our, for example, performance on cognitive tasks when we're older. And in terms of the other question around getting rid of age, no, so here it's not. So the focus, I guess, of the campaign and combating ageism is not that, it's that age stops being a barrier and that it stops being used to systematically disadvantage individuals unfairly. It's not, for example, one can question, for example, why is there mandatory retirement at a certain chronological age? What does that age, which is an arbitrary factor, tell you about a person's capacity to continue working and their willingness to continue working? So it's around how do we eliminate those barriers that are there and that are basically there because of something as arbitrary as our chronological age. So it's about changing that. It's about changing this negative discourse around aging, engaging people in conversations around aging. I think I had a conversation with Christine a few months ago, and it's true that, I mean, if you ask anyone, rarely anyone thinks and talks about the aging process until we're already older, which means that there's this reluctance in society to think of ourselves when we're older, as if you're rejecting that idea of this period of life, which can be beautiful and where you can contribute a lot and continue to do a lot of things. But again, to create that world where we can do all those things, it is important that we remove the barriers that we do see today that are often based on age. So yeah, the aim is not to remove age as that's impossible. I mean, age is one of the first things that we even notice when we interact with other people. But it's about removing or making sure that age is not used to divide society and create those disadvantages.
There's two more there. Just a thought about people feeling too old for certain venues. My 20 and 30-year-olds feel the same way. And Eileen says, regards to reason one for your research, change the narrative. Death is a natural part of living, which is obviously very true.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And this is part also of us as human beings, I guess, often being reluctant to engage in those conversations and even thinking of ourselves projecting what we may be like when we're older. But there is this, I guess, I mean, as I was saying earlier, we've all been raised in an ageist society, but it is also within our hand to start making change so that generations to come as well, I mean, so that we start addressing it now and the generations to come are not raised in an ageist society as well.
Absolutely. Look, Vania, I know you've got a really busy schedule and all the events coming up next month. I'd like to thank you for today. It's really been fantastic. I've been promoting the document and the toolkit amongst our staff in DCU, and hopefully we'll be having a couple of events ourselves to use some of the toolkit resources. And listen, thank you very much. Keep up the good work, and we all have to band together in solidarity to change the narrative on aging. So I'd like to thank you very much today, and I'll tell everybody will have the recording later on this evening. So thank you, Vania.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you everyone for the wonderful questions. I really hope that you find the toolkit and the resources helpful, and please do send us your feedback, because we, as I said, it's a living toolkit. We plan to improve it, and we can only improve it with your help.
Great. Take care.